If you have ever struggled with your high key or ethereal images and then feeling a little bit washed out or lackluster, then today's video is going to be of interest to you, so please do stick around to the end of the video. We're going to be talking about mid-tone contrast today and how it can be used to add that little bit of punch, but still maintain the open shadows and highlight detail that you want in your ethereal or high key images. So if we jump straight into this image here from the Isle of Harris, we can go over to the Develop module and take a look at adding some mid-tone contrast. So I'm going to do this through the masking panel, and I'm going to focus mainly on the foreground here. There's some nice streaking from this long exposure of a receding wave, but compared to the rest of the image, it's just lacking that little bit of punch. So with the linear gradient tool, that's how I'm going to select the portion of the image that I want to work on most. Now, in the latest update of Adobe Lightroom version 12.3, we now have the Curves tool in the masking panel. So that's a great new addition, and the Curves tool is the perfect adjustment to be able to add mid-tone contrast. So what do I mean by mid-tone contrast here? If I turn off the overlay quick, and we just use this little dot icon, we can hover over our image, and the histogram is going to show us where that particular tone is on the curve. So for instance, we can go down into these shadows. So that's sort of maybe over here is the deepest shadow. So we don't really want to affect that. We want to affect something like this. We can see that that's put it right on that lower spike. And then if we go to maybe this section in here, we can see that that pin is sort of just over to the right of that right-hand spike. So between those two dots there is the bulk of the mid-tones, the middle tonalities, if you will. So adding contrast is just going to be a case of darkening the shadow portions, lightening the highlight portions. Contrast referring to the space between the highlights and the shadows, and increasing that space. So I'm going to darken this down a little bit, and we're just doing very subtle adjustments here. Now, what adding contrast has done has also introduced saturation. So I'm going to knock that off using just the saturation slider there, and very quickly from before to after, you can see we've added a nice punch and definition to this foreground without darkening it down too much. And as a contrast, I can show you here a version where I've done mid-tone contrast versus global contrast. We can see the effects are ever so slightly different. So to me, there's a time and a place to use the global contrast slider, and there's a time and a place to use the mid-tone contrast. So having adjusted for the saturation that the contrast has introduced, we can then also play around with the opacity slider. Maybe want a little bit more of that effect. And then we're noticing that this dip in the curve is affecting these deeper shadow portions of the image. So we can come down here and just look at the histogram, line that up, and maybe just bring those back up a bit. So from before to after, we're just adding contrast really to the mid-tones, keeping those shadows nice and open, but adding good punch and definition to the foreground. But I did also want to show a black and white variant here, because I think it demonstrates the difference between using global contrast and mid-tone contrast quite nicely. So this image is from the Isle of Harris as well, and it features in my latest on-location video for Pickfair, all about how to make ICM images. So if you are interested in that, there'll be a link down below in the description. But for now, I'm going to open this up in Photoshop, and we can play around with when to use global and when to use mid-tone contrast. We can see here I've made two groups, one for mid-tone contrast and one for global contrast. So I have made a curves adjustment, and that's just targeting that central portion of the image. A levels adjustment just to brighten things up a little bit, and then the mid-tone curves adjustment with a very similar curve profile as the last example. And you'll see here that that's maintaining those open shadows, brightening things up a bit, and overall just adding a little bit of punch while still keeping things feeling light and airy. So from before to after, that mid-tone contrast is really producing something quite nice. Turning that off, we can now look at the global adjustment version, where I've used a brightness contrast layer and bumped up the contrast to 42, so that's adding a good bit of punch. And then a curves adjustment where I'm just dragging the white and black slider to try and bring in some contrast. But of course, this is on a global level. It's adjusting all of the tones as opposed to trying to target just the midtones. So what we can see here is the resulting image is quite a bit darker, quite a bit more contrasty. Of course, this could be dialed in a little bit, and maybe it's something more like that, comparable to the mid-tone edit. But I would say if you are looking to maintain as much highlight fidelity and shadow detail as possible, then the mid-tone version is going to give you a lot more control over your contrast levels. So adjusting the global contrast is going to produce a lot more punch and drop down those shadows and bring those highlights up quite a bit more. And we can see that reflected in the histogram here. You can see how much more spread out this is versus this. Maybe subtle, but that little bit of difference in extra contrast is really what's providing such a different look. So in these high key images, and especially if we go back to the previous example, I really don't want to be crushing down a lot of these shadow details because that's going to just add way too much contrast to the scene for my intended edit. Using mid-tone contrast instead of global contrast just gives me a little bit more fine-tuned control to the final result. I hope this little tutorial on adding mid-tone contrast to your images and how to add that little bit of punch to your high-key ethereal photographs has been helpful. Do make sure to go and give this a try yourself, as well as leave a comment down below if you've liked the video, and of course subscribe to the Pickfair YouTube channel. Thanks for watching. We will see you in the next one. Cheers.